The morning they came for her father was the same morning Mira Cole had risen early to mend the tear in his work coat. She sat at the kitchen table with a needle between her fingers and the coat spread across her lap, watching the thin orange light of sunrise come slowly through the window. Everything outside was quiet. The chickens in the yard moved in their usual lazy circles. 2 farms over, a dog barked once and went silent. It was the kind of morning that feels safe, the kind that arrives at the door before the trouble does, wearing a calm face. She heard the horses before she saw them. 4 sets of hooves, fast and close together, coming up the lane from the direction of the main road. She stood and went to the window. The riders were already past the elm tree at the bend, and she knew from their dark coats who they were. Lord Edmund Holt's men had come through Grenfell before. They came when the grace period ended, and the letters stopped being answered, and the Count had grown tired of waiting. They came the way certain kinds of news always came, at an hour when you were still half inside the night. Owen Cole walked out of the barn before the riders reached the gate. That was her father. He had never once in 61 years waited inside for anything. He always said that walking out to meet a thing was better than having it find you crouching, and he said it with the conviction of someone who had tested the idea and found it useful. He came out with his hands loose at his sides, and his gray work coat open at the collar, and his boots unlaced, because he had heard the horses, and pulled them on in a hurry. He walked to the gate with the straight-backed, measured step of a man who already knew what was coming, and had decided not to run from it. Mira set down the coat and went to the door. The lead rider pulled up at the gate. His name was Ned Hale, and everyone in the valley knew him. He was a man of about 50, thick through the chest, with a beard going white at the jaw, and eyes that had been doing this work long enough to stop seeing it as anything personal. He had a voice that carried without effort. "Owen Cole," he said, "you are in breach of the Michaelmas tithe. Second notice has passed without settlement. You are to come with us to the Holt estate to account for the debt." Her father looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at the barn behind him, taking stock of it in the slow, deliberate way of a man who is noting what he is leaving. Then he turned his head and looked at Mira. She was standing in the open doorway with no shoes on the cold ground, and the needle still between her fingers. She had not put it down. She did not know why. He looked at her, the way a person looks at something they need to remember exactly, and she looked back at him, with the same desperation to hold the image still. Then one of the other riders moved his horse sideways, placing its enormous flank between them, and the moment was cut in half. She called his name. She stepped forward off the step. The horse moved again, and the rider did not even look at her when he shifted his weight. The animal was heavy and warm in the cold morning air, and it was an immovable wall. She stood on the frozen ground in bare feet and watched her father walk down the lane between the 4 riders. His boots were still not laced. He did not turn around. She stood at the open gate until the sound of the hooves had gone completely around the bend and disappeared. She could not have told anyone how long that was. A minute maybe. Maybe longer. The cold worked its way up through her feet and into her legs, and she did not move. Then she went inside and closed the door, and sat down on the kitchen floor with her back against the wall. The fire in the grate had gone cold at some point in the morning. She did not notice. She sat with her knees pulled up, and her forehead resting on them, and her hands loose on the floor, and she stayed there for a very long time. The village of Grenfell was not a large place. It sat in a shallow valley in an unremarkable part of the country, with one wide lane running down its center, a mill at the northern end, a church with a cracked bell in the tower, and about 60 households scattered across the farmland on either side. The people who lived there were mostly tenant farmers, tradespeople, and the families attached to those, and they had been living on land that belonged to Lord Edmund Holt's family for longer than anyone still alive could personally trace. The Holt estate lay 2 miles east, behind a wall of stone that ran for half a mile in both directions before curving out of sight. Most people in Grenfell had never been past the iron gate in that wall. Some had been inside involuntarily, and those people were different when they came back, if they came back, and the village did not like to look too directly at the difference. Owen Cole had been paying his tithe for 30 years. He had been a reliable payer, a man who organized his accounts with care, and settled what he owed, before it could become something larger. 3 bad harvests in a row had ended that record, and nothing else about Owen Cole had changed. But the record was what the tithe system looked at, and so the letter had come, and then the second letter, and then the men in the dark coats, and the gate left hanging open. In the days that followed, the village behaved in the particular way it always behaved around loss. People nodded to Mira in the lane. Dorothy Wren from the corner house left a loaf of bread on the step one morning without knocking. The miller's wife, Frances Card, said something brief and kind when Mira passed the mill. These were not acts of comfort so much as acknowledgments that the thing had happened, and that Mira was now carrying a version of it that everyone could see. She accepted the bread. She did the orders she had waiting. She fed the chickens and swept the floor and moved through the ordinary motions of her days, because the ordinary motions were the only channel for her hands while her mind did something else entirely. She thought about the dungeon. She did not know much about it, and what she thought she knew had passed through so many mouths over so many years that the facts and the fears had blurred together into something more like atmosphere than information. She knew it was underground, beneath the east wing of the main house. She had heard there were cells, perhaps 8, perhaps more. She had heard that the men inside were put to work in some capacity, though no one she had spoken to could say what work that was, or where exactly it happened, or under what conditions. She also knew that in 30 years of living in Grenfell, she had heard of exactly one person being released from that dungeon, who had not been released by Lord Holt's personal decision. One man, many years ago, had been let go when his family paid 3 times the original debt over 2 difficult years. He had come back thin and careful with his words, and had moved to another village within months. That was the only story of release anyone could point to. One man, one outcome, a decade or more behind them. She thought about this while she cooked. She thought about it while she sat at the table and tried to eat the amounts that would keep her from going hollow. She thought about it while she lay awake, in the room she had shared with no one but her own thoughts, since her mother died 5 years earlier, leaving just the 2 of them in the house, with its 3rd stair that creaked, and its kitchen that smelled of bread and cedar. She did not cry after the first day. She had cried on the floor of the kitchen for a long time, and then she had stopped, and she did not go back to it, because crying was its own kind of standing still, and she could feel, somewhere beneath the grief, that she did not have time to stand still. She started asking questions, not to everyone, and not in a way that announced itself as asking. She was careful about the shape of her conversations, framing things as curiosity, as idle interest, as the kind of wondering that anyone might do. She talked to Dorothy Wren about the families in the village who had men taken in previous years. She talked to the innkeeper, a man named Cecil who had lived in Grenfell all his life, and remembered things in the specific, unorganized way of people who have simply paid attention for a very long time. Cecil told her, over a cup of tea she bought him on a cold afternoon, that the walls of the dungeon were 2 feet thick, and the guards changed every 4 hours, and that nothing came in, and nothing went out. Not ever. Not in all the years he had been watching. "Nothing?" she said. Cecil looked at his cup. "Nothing that matters," he said. She walked home from the inn, thinking about those 3 words. Nothing that matters. It was not the same as nothing at all. There was a distinction between a wall with no door and a wall with a door that no one had found yet. She did not know yet whether a door existed, but she had begun to listen for it. She spent 3 more evenings asking the kind of questions that did not sound like questions. She talked to the old sexton at the church, a thin man named Walter with very clean hands, about the history of the Holt estate. Walter liked nothing more than local history, and needed almost no encouragement. He told her, among other things, that the current estate had been built on the foundation of a much older structure, a gatehouse from several centuries back, when the valley had been a crossing point for northern trade routes. Gatehouses from that period had multiple exits, Walter said, with the mild pleasure of someone sharing a piece of carefully stored knowledge. You needed to be able to leave in more than one direction, if the main gate was forced. It was simply how they built things then. "And were those exits sealed when the later house went up?" Mira said. Walter thought about it. Some would have been found and closed. Some would have just been built over. New stone laid on top of old passages. Forgotten. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. Stonework from that period was built to last. If a passage was sound when it was covered, it could still be sound now. She walked home from the church in the early dark, and stood in her kitchen for a long time before she lit the lamp. She was thinking about old passages and new stone, and the specific difference between a door that had been closed and a door that had been forgotten. 4 days later, while she was buying thread from Dorothy Wren's husband at the market stall, Dorothy mentioned, in the course of a longer conversation about something else entirely, that her mother had gone once to see a woman who lived at the edge of the forest, north of the village. An old woman. People called her Agnes Fell. She had been there for as long as anyone in the village could remember, and her mother had gone to her about a wound on her leg that had refused to close for weeks. Did it help? Mira asked. Closed in 4 days, Dorothy said. My mother never said exactly what the woman did. She paused. People call her strange things. You know how talk goes. What kind of things? Mira said. Dorothy looked briefly uncomfortable. A witch. That kind of thing. Old talk. Mira nodded and bought her thread and walked home. She put the spool on the table and sat looking at it for a while. She thought about all the things she had gathered over the past 2 weeks. An old foundation with forgotten passages. An old woman in the forest who knew the valley at a depth that even Walter the sexton did not, and who the whole village both feared and quietly respected. She lay awake that night for a long time. By the time the sky began to lighten at the edges, she had made up her mind. She was going to find Agnes Fell, not because she had a plan yet, but because a plan needed to start somewhere, and the only thread she had found that seemed to lead somewhere real was the one that ran north, toward the forest, toward the hollow where an old woman had been sitting, apparently, for a very long time. She had a direction. She got up and made tea, and went to the window, and looked at the lane. It was empty, and ordinary, and cold, the way it was every morning. The elm tree at the bend stood still in the gray light. The gate at the edge of the property was the same gate it had always been. She drank her tea and started planning. The first thing she did was spend 4 more days listening before she did anything else. She was not a reckless person. Going to the woman in the hollow without preparation seemed like the kind of move that made for interesting stories but poor outcomes, and Mira Cole had never been the sort of person who confused those two things. She had grown up in a village where the difference between a thought and a plan was the difference between wishing and doing, and she had long ago chosen doing. She went back to Cecil at the inn and bought him another cup, which loosened him considerably. He told her that Agnes Fell had been in the hollow north of the village for longer than he could remember, and that she had been there when his own father was young, which made her age remarkable by any ordinary standard. He said this with a shrug, in the way that people shrug at things they have long since decided not to question. Does she come into the village? Mira asked. Rarely, said Cecil. When she does, she takes what she needs from the market and goes. She doesn't talk much. Do people go to her? Cecil considered the question for a moment, with the careful deliberateness of a man who has discovered that deliberateness, applied consistently, keeps you out of most trouble. Some do, he said, when the other roads have run out. What other roads? Mira asked. He looked at her for a moment. The ordinary ones, he said. The locked kind of problem. The kind that other ideas don't reach. He finished his cup and set it down with a small sound. She knows things. About this valley, and the things in it. Old things. Mira thanked him and walked home slowly, thinking about the locked kind of problem, and the roads that ran out. She went back to Walter the sexton one more time, and steered the conversation carefully back to the original structure beneath the Holt estate. Walter, delighted to be consulted further on a topic he felt well qualified to discuss, told her more than he had before. He described the original gatehouse in more detail, explaining that it had been built in an era when control of movement through the valley had significant practical value, and that the people who built such structures took the question of alternative exits seriously. He said the drainage systems of that period were typically integrated with the structural passages, meaning that a drainage exit from the original building would have run underground for some distance before emerging at a natural low point. Where would a natural low point be, in relation to the estate? Mira asked, with the careful tone of someone asking a purely theoretical question. Walter thought about it. The valley runs northeast from the estate. There is a ridgeline there, and several springs come out of the base of it. If the original structure had a drainage passage running northeast, it would logically exit somewhere near those springs. He looked at her mildly. Are you researching the history of the area? I find old buildings interesting, she said. He accepted this and told her 2 more things about the construction methods of the period, neither of which she was listening to particularly, because she was already thinking about what the northeast meant in relation to the forest, and the forest in relation to the hollow, and the hollow in relation to where Agnes Fell had been sitting for a very long time. She walked home through the cold afternoon and wrote nothing down on paper, because paper could be found. She wrote it all down in her head instead, in the careful, sequential way her mother had taught her to memorize a sewing pattern before starting, beginning to end, then end to beginning, until the whole thing lived in her hands rather than just her eyes. She had been asking questions for 2 weeks and 4 days. She had the outline of something that could, given the right circumstances and the right conversation with the right person, become a plan. What she did not yet have was the detail at the center of it, the specific knowledge that Walter and Cecil and Dorothy together could not give her. Only Agnes Fell could give her that. On the morning of the 16th day since they had taken Owen Cole, she put on her warmest coat, laced her boots, and walked north out of the village toward the trees. The forest above Grenfell was not the kind of place people cut through on their way to somewhere else. It was dense, and grew close to itself, with an undergrowth that made you feel the trees were leaning inward on purpose, and a canopy that closed overhead, before you had gone 40 steps into it. The path was narrow and not well worn, used infrequently and by few, and it wound through the trees with the indirect logic of a path that had formed by accident rather than intention. Mira had walked it twice in her life, both times as a child with her mother, and she remembered it being longer and darker than it looked from the outside, which it was. She crossed the mossy log over the stream without hesitating. She moved through the undergrowth without turning back. She was not afraid of trees or darkness or silence. She had spent enough of the past 2 weeks afraid of real things, to have no room left for the other kind. The hollow was a shallow dip in the land, where the trees thinned slightly, and a spring ran out of the base of the ridge into a stone basin that was old enough to have no clear origin. The house was built of dark stone, low and long, with a patched roof, and a chimney putting out a thin, steady line of smoke. Around it was a garden that looked unplanned but was not, even under the frost. The arrangement of the plantings had the deliberate quality of long knowledge, things placed exactly where they needed to be, and for reasons a casual eye would not see. There was no door, only a heavy curtain of oiled wool across the entrance. Mira stood in front of it and was still deciding how to announce herself when a voice came through from inside. "Come in, out of the cold. You have been on my path for 10 minutes. Mira pulled the curtain aside and stepped in. The room was warm, and it smelled of herbs and beeswax, and something older beneath those, something earthier, and less easy to name. It was a single large room, orderly in the way of places where everything has a purpose, and has been in its purpose for a long time. Dried plant bundles hung from the beams. Jars and bowls lined the shelves in a size progression that was almost mathematical. A fire burned in the grate with a pot above it giving off something savory and slow. Agnes Fell sat in a chair by the fire. She was a small woman, whose age had compressed into something compact and upright, like wood that has been seasoned until it is denser than it looks. Her hair was white and pulled back simply. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her eyes were extremely clear. She looked at Mira with the particular attention of someone who has been waiting for a specific thing, and is noting whether this is it. "Sit down," she said. Mira sat in the chair across from her, which was clearly kept for visitors. Agnes looked at her for a moment. "Owen Cole's daughter," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," Mira said. "I heard he was taken. 16 days ago." Agnes nodded. She looked at the fire for a moment, then back at Mira. "What do you want from me?" Mira had prepared several framings for this conversation over the past few days. She had considered starting with the historical question, the architecture angle, working around to what she needed gradually. But sitting in front of this woman, with those clear eyes on her, she found that none of it felt right. The woman across from her was not someone you worked around. You simply said what you meant and let her respond to that. "I want to know if there is a way into the Holt dungeon from outside the estate walls," Mira said. "And if there is, I want to know where it is." Agnes looked at her without any expression changing. The fire crackled between them. The pot made its small, steady sound. "Why?" Agnes said. "My father is in there," Mira said, "and other people's fathers and sons and brothers are in there. And I have been standing at the edge of a wall for 2 weeks, trying to find a door, and I believe you know where it is." Agnes was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of uncertainty, the quiet of someone deciding how much to say. "I know where the door is," she said. Mira's hands, folded in her lap, went very still. I have known about it for a long time, Agnes said. I have not told anyone, because until now, no one has come to me with the right combination of reasons and patience in their eyes at the same time. She looked at Mira steadily. But there is more to it than the door. There always is, Mira said. Agnes almost smiled. That, she said, is what we need to talk about. She rose from her chair with the careful deliberateness of someone who has learned to manage the requirements of a very old body without making a performance of it. She went to the back of the room and returned carrying a flat piece of birch bark wrapped in oiled cloth. She set it on the small table between them and unfolded the cloth. On the pale inner surface of the bark, someone had etched marks with a pointed tool. Lines and angles and small shapes, precise and deliberate, nothing decorative about them. Once Mira oriented herself to the pattern, she recognized it as the Holt estate viewed from above. The outer walls, the main house, the east wing. Below the east wing, the dungeon, drawn as a row of small rectangles along a central corridor. And below the dungeon, running outward, curving northeast, a single thin line, leading away from the estate entirely, to a mark near the edge of the bark labeled in small letters, with the word spring. Mira looked up. The spring in the forest, Agnes said. 280 yards northeast of the estate wall. The passage runs from beneath the east wing of the dungeon to a drainage exit at the base of the ridge. It was part of the original gatehouse drainage, built before the Holt house was ever laid on top of it. She paused. The drainage exit collapsed inward, about 60 years ago. I had it cleared in sections over 6 years, working at night, with 2 people I trusted. It has been open for 40 years. Mira looked at the map again. 40 years. The line on the bark was thin and certain, the work of a steady hand. Why did you open it? Mira said. Because I knew that one day it would be needed, Agnes said, and I did not want to be the reason it was not ready. She pointed to the dungeon level on the map. The passage enters the east wing from below, through a crawl space beneath the floor of the lowest cell. But the lowest cell is separated from the rest of the cell block by an iron gate, locked from the corridor side. From the passage end, you cannot reach the lock. Mira understood immediately. Someone has to be on the inside to open it. Someone has to be inside the estate, Agnes said, working close enough to the dungeon to reach that gate at the right moment. Not once, many times, over however many months it takes to clear the cells. The fire made small sounds between them. Outside the curtain, the wind moved through the trees. Mira sat with the shape of what she was hearing and let it become fully real to her. What staff is Lord Holt short of? She said. Agnes looked at her with something that was very close to approval. Laundry girls, she said. He had 2. One left in October to marry. The other fell ill in November and has not come back. Mira nodded slowly. She looked at the line on the bark map one more time, a thin line running from the dark beneath the estate to the spring in the forest. 40 years of waiting. Tell me the rest, she said. Agnes settled back in her chair. There is a part of this that stops most people, she said. I want you to hear it before you say anything else. Tell me. In order for this to work, Agnes said, the person who goes in must stay in, not for a few weeks, until the cells are cleared, or until Lord Holt's authority over them ends, whichever comes first. The laundry staff at that estate sleep there, eat there, and are not permitted to leave without a signed pass from the steward. A new girl, asking for passes regularly, would attract attention, so the person inside is bound there. She met Mira's eyes. They become fixed to that place. Their shadow stays on that floor whether they want it to or not, because they chose it, and choosing it made it real. Mira looked at the fire. She could feel the weight of what Agnes was describing, the specific and particular weight of it, and she did not flinch from feeling it. If the person inside is discovered, she said, what happens? Agnes let the silence answer for her. They end up in the cells, Mira said. Yes, said Agnes. Then the work ends. Yes. They sat with this for a moment. How many people are in the dungeon now? Mira asked. 21, Agnes said. I keep count. Mira looked at the map one last time. Then she looked at the old woman across from her, who had opened a passage 40 years ago and kept it open, and waited. Come back in 3 days, Agnes said. Before we begin anything that cannot be reversed, I will ask you once more, plainly, whether you are willing. Between now and then, think about it. Not about your father, about yourself, about what you will give up, and what it will feel like when you cannot take it back. Mira stood. She picked up her gloves. I will think, she said. She walked home through the forest in the pale winter afternoon, and her mind was busy and very quiet at the same time, the way a mind gets when it has found the shape of a problem it is capable of solving, and is beginning, for the first time, to believe that solving it is actually possible. She thought for 3 days, exactly as Agnes had asked. She did not hurry the thinking or soften its edges. She did not look for ways to make the question easier than it was. She took what she would be giving up and held it in both hands, and turned it over, until she knew every side of it. The way she examined a garment before beginning to mend it, checking every seam and every stress point before committing the first stitch. She would be giving up her house. The fact that it was not large, and not particularly valuable, did not change what it was. Her mother had lived every year of her life in it. Her father had built the barn attached to it board by board with his own hands. On a summer she could still see clearly, him on the roof with the sun behind him, her on the ground watching, both of them happy about something she could not now remember. Every room carried a version of Owen Cole in it. His coat on the peg by the door, his cup on the shelf above the second window, the creak in the third stair that he had always meant to fix and never got to, in the way that the things most embedded in a life are always the things that wait for the right quiet moment, and the quiet moment never quite arrives. She would be giving up the work, her trade, the sewing orders, the rhythm of them, the particular satisfaction of a well-done seam, and the way a garment came, right when you understood its logic. Inside the estate, she would do laundry. She would wash and press and fold the household linen of a man who had taken her father from her, and she would do it with a straight back and a face that said nothing, and she would do it every single day. She would be giving up the ability to go where she chose. This was the thing that took the longest to sit with, because it was the least dramatic and the most constant. She was not a person who roamed. She did not travel far or often, but knowing that the lane at the end of her path was open, that the road beyond the village was open, that the whole wide world beyond that was open even if she rarely used it, was something she had never once had to think about, because it had always simply been true. Removing it would not feel like removing a luxury. It would feel like a change in the nature of the air itself. And she thought about what happened if she was found out. She thought about it clearly, and without flinching. She thought about what Lord Holt did to people who caused him problems. And she thought about Ned Hale's eyes, which had the flat, practical quality of a man who did not distinguish between the message and the messenger. She thought about what being found out would mean for the people who were not yet through the passage, the ones still in the cells, who would have been told something was coming, and would wait for it, and it would not come. She thought about all of this in the winter cold of her kitchen, and the winter dark of her bedroom, and the winter quiet of the lane outside her gate. She let it all be as real as it was. And then she thought about the other side of the scale. 21 people were in that dungeon. By the time she cleared the current occupants, more would have been taken to fill the space. Lord Holt was taking people at an increasing rate. He had taken a boy of 17 the previous spring. He had taken a man with 3 small children in the summer before that. He would keep taking people, because there was no consequence for it, because the wall between the dungeon and the rest of the world was exactly as thick as Cecil had said, and nobody had ever found the door, except an old woman in the forest, who had been waiting 40 years for someone to come and use it. The door was there, the passage was there. The question was not whether it could be done, the question was whether she was willing to pay what it cost. She thought about her father walking down the lane without looking back. On the 3rd day she went back to the hollow. Agnes was in the same chair, her hands in her lap, her eyes clear and waiting. She looked as though she might have sat there without moving for the full 3 days, which Mira suspected was not entirely far from the truth. "Sit down," Agnes said. Mira sat. "Have you thought about it?" "Yes," said Mira. "And? I am going to do it." Agnes looked at her for a moment, with the particular attention of someone checking not the answer, but the quality behind it. Whatever she was looking for, she seemed to find enough of it. "Tell me why," she said. Mira thought about it for a moment. "Because the door exists," she said, "and someone has to open it from the inside. and I am the person standing closest to it with a reason large enough to stay." Agnes studied her face for another few seconds. Then she nodded, once, and said, "Then we begin." What followed was the most concentrated month of Mira's life. Agnes did not transform her in any visible sense. She did not change the way Mira looked or walked or spoke, but she filled in the spaces in Mira's knowledge that the work would require, with the methodical patience of a woman who had been preparing for this for a very long time. There was a man Agnes called only a contact in the market town. He was elderly, skilled, and asked no questions. He produced documents that named Mira Cole as Mira Grant, a laundress with 7 years of household experience from a town 40 miles north. The references he attached were thorough and detailed and entirely invented, from households that did not exist, signed by employers who were not real. They looked, to a professional eye, completely genuine, because they were the product of many years of practice at looking completely genuine. Agnes taught her the layout of the estate in precise detail. She had contacts among the men who made regular supply deliveries, and among a woman who had worked in the estate kitchen a decade earlier, and still carried the floor plan of the place in her memory as clearly as a map. Mira learned the corridors. She learned the guard rotation schedule. She learned the habits of the steward, a man named Jeffrey Plum, who had been at the estate for 20 years, and whose particular brand of thoroughness had long ago given way to the particular brand of efficiency that comes from knowing a place so well that you stop looking at it. She learned the connecting passage that Agnes had described, a narrow service corridor running from the east wall of the laundry room to the north end of the cell block, used historically by kitchen staff to deliver supplies to guards, and largely forgotten in its specific layout by the current estate administration. She learned the gate, the iron gate at the corridor end, locked from the corridor side by a bar and a bracket, simple, fast to operate, designed for movement, not security, liftable by hand in seconds. Agnes also taught her something more difficult than any floor plan. She taught her invisibility, not the kind in stories, but the practical kind, which is a specific way of moving through a space that gives no one a reason to look at you twice. Mira was naturally observant, which meant she naturally looked at things with interest, and interest was the enemy of invisibility. She had to learn to see without appearing to look, to listen without appearing to listen, to be present without appearing to be present. She practiced the expression of a person whose only thought is the task immediately in front of them. She practiced it until it stopped feeling like a mask and started feeling like a room she could inhabit. On a night 2 weeks before Mira was to present herself at the estate, they walked together to the spring in the forest north of the estate wall. Agnes carried a lantern. The entrance to the passage was low and hidden behind a fall of ivy and a loose arrangement of stone that looked like natural collapse and was not. Inside, it was narrow and cold and smelled of old stone and underground water, but the floor was dry and the walls were solid, and the stonework was exactly what Walter the sexton had described, built to last and having lasted. 40 years, Mira said quietly, crouching in the entrance. 40 years, Agnes confirmed. Mira looked into the dark of the passage. She could not see the end of it from where she was. She thought about what was at the other end, behind the iron gate, in the cells that Agnes kept her count of. She did not say anything else. She stood up, and they walked back to the hollow through the winter dark, and there was nothing between them that needed to be said. The work was ahead of them. They had both decided to do it. That was enough. On the last night before she was to go, she sat alone in her house by candlelight. She built a fire and cooked a real meal, and went through every room once, touching the things she was leaving. Her mother's chair, her father's coat on the peg. She put her hand on the third stair and pressed down, and heard the creak, and stood there for a moment with her hand on the wood. She locked the front door in the morning and left the key with a neighbor, saying only that she was going to look for work and did not know how long she would be away. The neighbor took the key without question. People did not ask many questions in Grenfell, because they had learned over the years that the answers were often heavier than the asking. She walked to the forest hollow before the village was properly awake. Agnes handed her the packet of documents through the curtain gap without pulling it fully aside. She took them and put them in the inner pocket of her coat, against her chest, where she could feel them with her breathing. "When the time comes," Agnes said, "I will send word through the soap delivery. The man who brings supplies, he will carry it in the lining of the order sheet." And until then, Mira said. Until then, Agnes said, you become the stone. Mira turned and walked east, through the gray early morning, toward the Holt estate, with the frost on the grass, and her breath making small clouds, and the documents against her chest. She did not look back at the village. She understood now why her father had not looked back at her. The iron gates of the Holt estate were old and heavy, set in a wall of stone that ran in both directions as far as the eye could follow, before curving out of sight. There was a small gatehouse on the inside, and the man who came to the gate when Mira rang the bell had the careful, assessing eyes of someone whose entire value to his employer rested on his capacity for suspicion. I am here to speak to Mr. Plum, Mira said. About the laundry position. He looked her over. Are you from the agency? I was directed to come in person, she said. I was told the position needed filling quickly. This was accurate. Agnes's delivery contact had let her know that Jeffrey Plum had been writing to the placement agency in town for 3 weeks, with diminishing patience. A young woman presenting herself at the gate on her own initiative was a more immediate solution than waiting for a letter to be answered. The gatekeeper considered this for a moment and went to send word. Jeffrey Plum was a round man of 64, who moved with the measured care of someone whose knees had filed their complaint some years ago and were now living with the consequences. He met her at the side entrance with the expression of a man who was cautiously hopeful but had learned caution from experience. She gave him the documents. He read them with the slow thoroughness of a man who had been deceived before and was not interested in repeating the experience. He asked 3 questions about her previous employment. She answered each with the specificity that Agnes had coached her on, unhurried and detailed and consistent, the kind of answers that come from memory rather than invention. The work is demanding, he said. Early starts. The household linen alone is considerable for 30 staff, not counting the family's rooms. You will work alongside Clara Briggs, who has been here 4 years. She manages the laundry room and you report to her there, and to me and everything else. He looked at her over the documents. You do not leave the grounds without a pass from my office. You do not ask about matters that do not concern your work. You do your job, and you are not a problem. Is that clear? Yes, sir, she said. Can you start today? Yes, she said. He took her to the laundry room, which occupied the western ground floor of the estate, separated from the east wing by the full length of the main corridor. The room was large and low-ceilinged, with wooden tubs along one wall, a set of drying racks, a long pressing table, and a shelf of supplies running the length of the far wall. It smelled of lye soap and damp wool, and the steam from the morning's work had made the air soft and close. Mira stood in the warmth of it and felt, for one very brief moment, the strangeness of having arrived. Clara Briggs was at the first tub. She was about 25, with strong arms and dark hair pinned back efficiently, and she had the look of someone who had made a private decision, some years ago, to keep her opinions to herself in this particular place. She glanced at Mira with quick, intelligent eyes, and then looked back at the linen. Plum introduced them in 2 sentences, and left. Clara looked at Mira for a moment. Done household laundry before? Yes, not this scale, but the work is the same. Another moment's assessment, then a nod. She pointed at the second tub. Start with the west wing bedroom linen. It came in this morning. Go easy on the lye on the whites. Mr. Plum has feelings about the smell. Mira tied on an apron, went to the second tub, and started work. That was how it began. Not with ceremony. With linen, and warm water, and the sound of cloth being worked. She began her first day as Mira Grant, the same way she would spend the next months, doing the work directly in front of her, with enough quiet competence to be unremarkable. In the first week she concentrated entirely on being exactly what the document said she was. She learned Clara's rhythms, and the schedule of deliveries and collections. She learned which members of the household staff moved through which corridors at which hours, because a laundress needed to know when corridors were clear to carry linen without being in anyone's way. It was a perfectly legitimate reason to pay close attention to the movement patterns of everyone in the building, and she used it with full and careful intention. On the 4th day she found the connecting passage for the first time. A door set into the east wall of the laundry room, nearly invisible because it was the same gray stone as the wall around it, and had no handle visible from the laundry side, only a recessed ledge at the edge. She found it by running her hand along the east wall during a quiet moment, which she did, as if checking for dampness in the plaster, which was a thing laundresses occasionally did. The door opened inward at the lightest pressure on the ledge. The passage behind it was exactly 3 feet wide and about 6 feet long, ending at a second door that stood slightly ajar. Beyond that door was the north end of the east cell corridor. She closed it immediately, went back to her tub, and kept working. She had found the gate. Everything else now was a matter of time. In the second week, she built her patterns. She was the first into the laundry room in the morning and the last out each evening. She volunteered for tasks that required moving through different parts of the building, which gave her a consistent and legitimate reason to be in corridors at varying hours. She was quiet and efficient, and nobody had any reason to look at her longer than courtesy required. She also began to listen to the kitchen. The guards ate at a different hour than the household staff, but from the same kitchen. And kitchen talk, Mira found, was its own kind of information. Not careless talk. The guards were not careless men, but they spoke about their work the way anyone speaks about their work, in the passing mentions and small complaints that add up, over time, to a fairly complete picture. She learned that there were 22 prisoners, one more than Agnes's count. She learned the guard shift structure and the specific hours. She learned that the prisoners worked in the stone yard on the east side of the grounds each day, cutting stone for a building project that had apparently been running for 2 years. She learned that the evening meal was delivered to the cells by a kitchen runner, a boy named Sam, who did the run alone each evening in the hour before the night rotation began. She watched Sam for 3 days. He was 12 years old with large ears and the expression of someone who found the dungeon run uncomfortable in a way he had never quite examined closely enough to articulate. He went, he delivered, he came back, and he set down the empty tray with the air of someone grateful to have the task behind him for another day. On the 8th day, she offered to help him prepare the meal tray on an evening when the kitchen was particularly busy. He accepted. She became, over the following weeks, an occasional additional hand for the tray preparation, useful enough to be welcomed, present often enough to become unremarkable, consistent enough to give her the access she needed. She began leaving small pieces of paper inside bread rolls on the trays she helped prepare. Nothing written, just folded patterns, pressed into the interior of the roll before it was handed to Sam. Patterns with meaning, for anyone who had been told what they meant, which the prisoners had not yet been told. But she was beginning the chain. She was announcing a presence. She was saying, to the dark on the other side of that gate, that someone outside was paying attention. On the 7th evening she helped prepare the tray. One of the bread rolls came back empty, as they all did. But inside the hollow of this particular one was a small mark pressed into the remaining crust. A thumb indent, arranged in a pattern that was not accidental. Someone inside was paying attention back. She stood in the kitchen holding that empty roll, and pressed her lips together, and did not allow herself to feel what she was feeling, until she was back in the laundry room with the door closed. Then she stood in the quiet of it for 3 full minutes doing nothing at all, breathing steadily, before she put the roll down and washed her hands and went to bed. She had made contact. The rest was going to take time, but she had already given herself to time. She was the stone. She was the dark other people were going to escape through. That was not a role played in a week. It was a role played every ordinary hour of every ordinary day, with nothing to show for it and no one to see, until suddenly, it was everything. She lay in the narrow bed in the servants' quarters and listened to the quiet of the estate around her. She was 3 weeks in. She had been Mira Grant for 3 weeks, and no one in this building knew her name. And the gate was at the other end of the connecting passage, and 22 people were behind it. She shut her eyes. Tomorrow, the work continued. The man who had left the thumb mark in the bread roll was named Will Marsh. She did not know this right away. She learned it over 3 weeks. In the incremental way she was learning everything. Building a picture from small details. The way you build a wall from individual stones, each one placed with care, and each one necessary, to the ones that come after. The subsequent marks, refined over 8 exchanges across 8 evenings, told her he was in the second cell from the south end, that he was literate, that he could be trusted to keep what he knew to exactly himself, and that he understood patience in the specific way that useful people understand it, not as resignation but as a tool. She found out his name on a morning when she was carrying a basket of pressed linen down the east corridor, and heard one of the guards call it, Marsh, back of the line. She matched the name to the cell position she had established through the bread roll exchanges, and Will Marsh became a person instead of a thumb mark. He was about 40, with the broad build of a man who had worked physically all his life and not lost it. He had been brought in 8 months before Mira arrived, for a debt arising from a land dispute that had gone against him in the estate court. He had a wife and 2 daughters in a village 5 miles east. He had not seen them or heard from them in 8 months. He had no way of knowing whether they knew he was alive. She confirmed this information gradually, through the exchanges and through careful observation. She also confirmed, over the same period, that the thumb mark code could be extended. By the 3rd week of contact, she and Will Marsh had developed a system of 10 signals, enough to communicate basic positions, timings, and confirmations. She did it through the bread roll folds when she helped with Sam's tray, and she began receiving signals back in a second form as well, stitching. Will Marsh's shirt came back to the laundry each week. She had begun, quietly and without explanation, to add small stitching along the seam of certain prisoners' shirts before Sam returned them, stitching that carried information about what she was doing and what she needed. The shirts came back with additional thread worked in, sometimes just a strand or two, in specific intervals that corresponded to the signal code. It was slow. It was extraordinarily slow, and there were days when the slowness sat heavily on her, particularly when she thought about what the slowness meant in terms of days inside a cell. But slow was the only pace that did not get people killed. She had understood that from the beginning, and she held it, on the difficult days, like a stone in the hand, something real, something grounding. By the end of her 2nd month inside, she had established coded contact with 3 prisoners: Will Marsh, a man named Peter Dove in the 4th cell who had been taken for speaking against a Holt land seizure at a public meeting, and a young man named Arthur Lane, who was 17 years old, and had been taken when his family's debt grew beyond what they could close. She had heard about Arthur Lane before she ever came to the estate. He was the one who had made something sharpen in her chest when Dorothy Wren mentioned him in passing last autumn. He was younger than she had let herself picture. Clara Briggs noticed things. Mira had been accounting for this. Clara was not a talker, but she was observant, and 4 years of working in a closed environment had refined her observations considerably. She noticed that Mira stayed late. She noticed the evenings with Sam's tray. She said nothing about any of it for 6 weeks. Then, on a Tuesday morning at the pressing table, she said without looking up, "Sam says you've been helping with the evening run. He needed a hand some nights," Mira said, keeping her iron moving steadily. Clara pressed another fold. "I've worked here 4 years," she said, in a tone that was giving information rather than making conversation. "I've seen 3 people try to do something about what happens in those cells." She set down the iron. 2 of them were found out. The room was quiet. "What happened to them?" Mira said. "They became what the cells are for," Clara said simply. Mira kept her eyes on her work. "And the 3rd?" "Went slowly," Clara said. "Left before it was finished. I don't know the end of it." She picked up the iron again. "I'm telling you this because I don't want to see you become the first kind." Mira looked at her then. Clara was looking at the linen with a perfectly neutral face. "Thank you," Mira said. "I haven't heard anything," Clara said. "I haven't seen anything, that is all." It was more than Mira had expected, and more than she could have asked for. Clara's silence was a gift she could not repay, and would not try to. In the 8th week she found her father. The contact chain had extended through Will Marsh's cell to the adjacent one, and from there further, and a message came back through 4 people that Owen Cole was in the 8th cell, the furthest south, and that he was managing, and that he had been asking whatever way he could, whether any word had come from outside. She went to the laundry room after everyone had left that evening, and stayed there for a while in the dark. She sat on the floor against the wall. She allowed herself, in that private dark, to feel everything she had been carefully holding at arm's length for 8 weeks. All of it, the morning on the lane, the frozen ground under her bare feet, the horse's flank between her and him, the sound of his footsteps going away. She let it all arrive and be fully real. She gave herself 10 minutes. Then she stood up and washed her hands and went to bed. By the end of the 2nd month, she had a complete map of the cell block in her head. 22 prisoners, each named, each in a known cell, each aware through the chain that something was happening, though none yet knew the what or the when. She had confirmed the gate mechanism from Will Marsh's descriptions. He had been close enough to the connecting passage to observe the lock end, a bar and a bracket, liftable in seconds. exactly as Agnes had described. She had identified the timing window, a section of approximately 22 minutes in the night rotation, when reduced attention fell on the north end of the cell corridor. She had confirmed this by observing the guard movements from the connecting passage side on 3 separate nights, opening the passage door a fraction for no more than 30 seconds at a time. 22 minutes. For 5 people, moving in sequence, 30 seconds apart, through a 40-yard passage in the dark. She could do it. She needed 2 more things. She needed a signal to Agnes for each specific escape night. She confirmed through the soap delivery channel that Agnes's people would monitor for her mark. A specific fold pattern on the empty supply list returned to the delivery man, and that they would have someone at the spring entrance each night she signaled for 3 days in advance. Then she identified the first group. 5 people: Will Marsh, Peter Dove, Arthur Lane, Frank Doyle from the 3rd cell, and a man named George Blunt from the 6th cell. She sent the word through the chain: "Be ready, on 3 days' notice. Wait for the signal." 3 days later, she sent the signal in the evening bread roll. The night was set. The night of the first escape was overcast and dark, the moon completely covered, which meant the stone yard and the eastern grounds were in the kind of darkness that hid movement without any help from anyone. She had known, working back from the conditions she needed, that she would require weather, a specific guard arrangement, and a quiet evening in the steward's office. All 3 had arrived on the same night, which she had been waiting for without knowing the exact date, and the waiting had paid out in one particular evening in her 9th week inside the estate. She had been in the laundry room since the evening meal, working past the normal hour, which she had done often enough that no one thought anything of it. Clara had left at the usual time. The corridor outside had gone quiet. She waited until the last movement beyond the door had settled into the deeper quiet of an estate at night. Then she moved to the connecting passage door and opened it. The passage was 3 feet wide and completely dark. She did not bring a light. She had walked it in the dark before, testing it deliberately on 2 separate evenings, memorizing the feel of the floor and the slight angle it took at the midpoint. She moved through it without hesitation, managing her breathing, counting the seconds the same way she counted stitches, not to hurry, but to know exactly where she was. She found the second door and pushed it open slowly, managing the weight of it with both hands. The north end of the east cell corridor opened in front of her. One lantern at the far south end gave off the dim orange quality of light that was more shadow than illumination. She could hear, very faintly, the guard at that end, the small sounds of someone stationary and inattentive. He was at the south. The outer gate reporting guard had just made his move. She had 14 minutes from the moment she opened the gate. She went to the iron gate. She put her hands on the bar and lifted it from the bracket. In the 2 preceding weeks, she had managed, on 2 separate quiet evenings, to apply a thin coat of grease to the bracket's interior, taken from the kitchen lard supply in amounts too small to notice. The bar moved without sound. The gate swung inward. On the other side, in the darkness of the north cell area, she felt the change in the air that comes when someone who has been holding completely still becomes aware that something has shifted. She put her hand through the gate, into the corridor, and held it. A hand closed around hers, large and rough, the hand of a man who had built things for decades. Will Marsh. She pressed his hand once, firmly, and let go. That was the signal. Go now. Move south and collect the others in order. Come to the passage entrance. She went back into the passage and waited at the entrance, crouching in the low space with her back to the wall, counting seconds under her breath. At the far end of the corridor, she heard the guard's footsteps begin the crossing that she had timed and studied and confirmed 3 times over. 20 steps to the outer gate from the entrance, 12 seconds where neither guard could see the north end of the corridor. She counted to 12 in her head. Then she felt the first person enter the passage, the brush of a shoulder against the stone, the sound of a careful foot on the floor. Then another, then another. She did not count them by sight, she counted them by sound, by the small particular sounds of 5 people moving through a narrow space in absolute darkness, with the particular focus of people who understand exactly what depends on their silence. At the 5th person, she sealed the passage entrance, ivy back in place, stones arranged as they had been, and went first through the dark, leading them, one hand on the wall, counting her paces, 38 paces to the exit. She reached it at 38 and found the outer stone and pushed it aside carefully from the inside. Cold air, the smell of frost and open ground and forest. She stepped aside and guided them through the opening one by one. 5 people, into the cold dark outside. She could not see their faces. She heard their breathing, fast and controlled, the breathing of people who are frightened and have decided what to do with their fear, rather than letting it take them. The last one through was Will Marsh. She knew it was him by the hand that found her arm in the dark for one brief second before he moved forward. She felt him wanting to stop, to say something. She pressed his arm gently forward, toward the tree line where Agnes's people were waiting with directions and a safe route north. She waited until she could no longer hear footsteps in any direction. Then she closed the passage entrance, arranged the ivy and stone back into their positions, went through the passage in the dark, and replaced the gate bar in its bracket. She stood in the laundry room and listened to the ordinary sounds of the estate around her. Nothing had changed. Nothing was wrong. Everything was exactly as it had been. She picked up the next sheet from the basket and began folding. Her hands were completely steady. If anyone had come through that door at that moment and looked at her, they would have seen a laundress working late, doing the ordinary work that laundresses do in a quiet building at night. Nothing about her face or her posture or her movements would have given them a reason to look twice. She had practiced this. She had practiced it until it was not a performance but simply the truth of what she was doing. She was folding a sheet, and that was real, and everything else was behind her eyes where it belonged. The discovery came at the morning head count. She heard about it through the kitchen at breakfast, which was where she heard most things. 5 cells empty. Lord Edmund Holt's response, as she had been told to expect, was not loud. His anger was the quiet, directed kind that went immediately into action rather than expression. He summoned Ned Hale. He summoned the overnight guards. He walked the cell block himself, according to Sam, who had heard it from the cook, who had heard it from a maid who passed the east corridor at a particular moment. In the kitchen, the air had the particular quality of a space where everyone knows something has happened and is watching very carefully to see what comes next. Not fear, awareness, the kind that keeps itself perfectly still. Mira ate her breakfast. She drank her tea. She said good morning to Clara, who said good morning back with her usual tone. Then she went to the laundry room and started the linen for the day. When Geoffrey Plum appeared to inform all staff that Lord Holt was reviewing estate security, and that each person was required to account for their movements the previous evening, Mira looked up with the mild cooperative attention that she had been practicing since before she arrived. "Of course, sir," she said. Her account was consistent, brief, and verifiable at its edges. Clara had seen her working when she left. The night cook had seen her briefly near the kitchen around the 8th hour. She had gone to her room and stayed there. Nothing in her account was wrong, because nothing in her account was a lie. The review concluded without any specific suspicion falling in her direction. The official explanation settled on the theory of outside assistance, someone over the wall, though no one could account for the method. Ned Hale doubled the outer wall patrol and added a new step to the evening rotation. The gate in the north cell corridor was apparently not examined closely enough to reveal any sign of use. She filed this carefully. She also adjusted the grease on the bracket, using a thinner application. She began planning who would go next. She had 5 people out and 17 still in the block. The window had changed slightly with the new rotation, but it had not closed. 3 days later, she was already learning its new shape. She sent the next signal 2 weeks after the first escape. 3 weeks passed between the first escape and the second, and they were the most demanding 3 weeks she had experienced in the estate. Not because of obvious danger. Danger, she had found, behaved predictably once you understood its patterns, and she had been studying its patterns from day one. The difficulty was more subtle than that. It was the difficulty of staying completely still, while everything around you moved faster. Holt changed 2 of the overnight guard rotations, and added a second man to the north end of the cell block for the first week following the disappearances. The doubled coverage put 2 guards in overlapping positions that left no section of the north corridor unwatched for more than 5 minutes at any point in the night. 5 minutes was not enough time for 3 people to move through a passage, let alone 5. She did not panic, she observed. She spent the 3 weeks doing nothing but watching, the way a person watches the tide for the current that will eventually carry them where they need to go. She watched the new rotation settle into the grooves of habit that all rotations eventually found. She watched which guards were rigorous and which were performing rigor, which was different. She watched for the human tendencies that no scheduling system could entirely remove. The stretch, the distraction, the predictable human pull toward the same comfortable position at the same comfortable time. By the end of 3 weeks, the doubled north end coverage had quietly reduced itself to a single guard again, because maintaining double coverage around the clock required more men than the rotation could sustain without affecting other areas. The window reopened. Not the same window as before, not the same timing, but a new one, slightly shorter, and at a different point in the night. She adjusted the group size, 3 people at a time instead of 5, to fit the narrower margin. It would take longer. But a longer timeline that stayed safe was worth more than a faster one that did not. Over the 8 weeks that followed, she managed 3 more operations, 3 people, then 3 more, then 2 more. 8 people additional to the original 5. 13 total, out of 22. 13 cells that were quietly empty, 13 people who had gone through the passage and out into the cold night air, and north toward the spring and beyond, toward directions and roads and lives that were no longer determined by Lord Holt. She did not know where they went. Agnes's network handled everything beyond the passage exit. Mira's responsibility began at the gate bar and ended at the stone cover at the spring entrance. What happened after that was something she did not need to know, and not knowing it was a form of protection for everyone, including herself. The 9th person out was her father. She had been holding this in a particular kind of patience for weeks, the hardest kind of patience, the kind you maintain for the things you care about most. She had been connected to Owen Cole through the bread roll chain since the 8th week, knew he was managing, knew he had understood that something was happening, and that he should be ready. She sent his signal at the end of the 7th week of the 2nd phase. She had not expected to be at the passage entrance when he came through. She had not planned for it to be anything particular. But when the 4th person in that night's group put a hand past her in the dark, and she felt the weight and roughness of it, the specific way it moved, she knew. She held it for 3 seconds. He held back. Then she pressed forward and he went, and she felt the cold air enter as the exit opened, and then he was through, and she sealed the entrance and stood alone in the passage in the dark for a moment. 3 seconds. She had allowed herself exactly 3 seconds. Then she went back through the passage and folded linen. By the 10th week, the investigation had been formally closed, which she knew, because Plum stopped holding the accountability checks and the padlock that had appeared on the connecting passage door's laundry side after the 3rd escape was quietly removed. Plum appeared to have concluded it was unnecessary work. She had been picking the lock each night with a bent wire and replacing it afterward, and the relief of not having to do that anymore was a small practical gift. Lord Holt, she gathered from kitchen conversation, had settled on the theory of a coordinated outside operation, a one-time event, unlikely to be repeated. The cells had been partially refilled with new prisoners over the preceding weeks, 3 new men taken for debts, 2 more for a complaint against a Holt land survey. The block now held 9 original prisoners plus the 5 new ones, 14 total. She began rebuilding the contact chain with the new arrivals. It was in this period that Lord Holt came to the laundry room. He arrived on a Wednesday afternoon with Ned Hale behind him. He did not say why. He looked around the room for a moment with the considered attention of a man checking something he had not checked in a while, and then his eyes found Mira. She looked back at him from the pressing table. "You," he said. "You have been here 3 months." "Yes, sir," she said. "Where are you from?" She told him. He listened. He asked one more question about her previous employment, and she answered it with the specific, consistent detail that had been part of her since before she arrived. He looked at her for a moment after that. His eyes were sharp and unhurried, and she met them with the steady mildness of a woman who has nothing to hide, which was the exact expression of a woman who had everything to hide, and had practiced the alternative so thoroughly that there was no practical difference. "We have had irregularities," he said. "I am making a point of knowing everyone who is here." "Of course, sir," she said. "I understand." He held her eyes for one more second. Then he looked around the room, nodded once, and left. Ned Hale followed him without looking at her. The room was quiet. The water in the tub was still. Mira turned back to the pressing table and kept working. She had passed. She was still invisible. But she had stood in Lord Holt's direct attention, and she knew, with the knowledge that comes from watching a thing very carefully, that his examination of her had not been entirely satisfied. He had let it go, for now. But he was looking, and looking was the beginning of finding, and she needed to slow down. She went to Clara that evening and said, briefly, that the pace of things would need to change for a while. Clara, who had said nothing, and seen nothing for 10 weeks, looked at the floor and nodded. "How long?" Clara asked. "Until I know it is safe again," Mira said. Clara nodded once and went back to the ironing. 9 original prisoners remained in the block, plus the 5 newer ones. 14. The cells were filling again. The work was not close to finished. She slowed down. She watched Ned Hale's new patrol changes with more care than before. She adjusted the timing of everything. She thought about what slowing down looked like when you were committed to continuing, and she made the adjustments that it required, and she waited. She had been waiting her whole life for things to take the time they needed. This was the same thing, only with higher stakes. She was the stone. She was the floor. The dark did not hurry. She did not hurry either. The message arrived in the lining of the soap order sheet on a Tuesday morning in the 14th week. She found it when she was logging the supply delivery in the laundry book, running her finger along the folded edge of the order sheet the way she always did as a routine check. The corner of the lining was fractionally stiffer than usual. She noticed it without reacting to it, the same way she noticed everything now, without reaction, without change of expression, without any outward sign at all. She did not open it until the evening, in the laundry room after everyone had gone. Agnes's handwriting was small and precise, and used no word it did not need. Troops from the county authority moving on Holt Estates. Expected arrival in 2 to 3 weeks. Lord Holt has been informed through his own contacts. He is expected to act on the prisoners before the troops arrive. Method unknown, timing unknown. I believe you have 10 days at the most. I will have people at the spring entrance each night for the next 12 days. Send your signal and move everyone remaining. Do not wait." She held the paper over the candle flame and let it burn entirely, and dropped the ash into the wash water, where it dissolved without a trace. Then she sat down on the floor of the laundry room, with her back against the wall. 14 prisoners remaining. 10 days. The previous operations had moved 3 or 4 people per night. To move 14 in 10 days would require 4 separate nights at minimum, each one separated by 2 or 3 days of recovery and re-preparation. That was manageable in normal conditions. These were not normal conditions. If Holt moved against the prisoners early in that 10-day window, any prisoners not yet through the passage would be lost. She thought about this for a very long time. One night, all 14. The passage was 40 yards long and 1 person wide. 30 seconds between each entry to manage the sound and the movement. 14 people at 30-second intervals meant 7 minutes of transit, plus time at both ends for the gate and the exit. She would need at minimum a 12-minute window, ideally 15. She had never had more than 22 minutes. 15 minutes was achievable if the right guard was on the North End assignment. There was a man named Roy who had been on the overnight rotation for 4 years and who had a personal habit, she had observed it on 3 separate nights, of spending the first hour of his block in the far south end of the corridor. He had apparently been doing this for so long that no one had questioned it. Roy assigned to the North End post meant his attention would be south, not north, for the first hour. She checked the upcoming rotation. Roy was on the North End assignment in 4 days. 4 days. She had 4 days to prepare a chain communication that normally took 10, to bring 14 people to readiness for a movement she had never attempted at this scale, and to arrange the precise signal timing with Agnes's network. She stood up from the floor, crossed to the laundry table, and began working through the steps in her head. She spent the next 4 days preparing with the focused intensity of a person who has eliminated everything except the one necessary thing. The contact chain communication went out in 3 stages, each bread roll coated with additional information layered on top of the base signal. She had never sent this much through the chain at once. It required Sam to carry 9 individual rolls on the Monday tray with specific positioning patterns that would mean nothing to him but everything to the people receiving them. Sam accepted her help with the tray without comment. He had long ago stopped noticing that she was there, which was the best thing she could have asked for. She also needed to bring the 2 newest prisoners into the chain, because they had arrived too recently to be incorporated yet. She achieved this through the adjacent cell contact, a message from an established prisoner to a new one, passed through the cell wall at the right moment. Both new men sent back confirmation by the 3rd day. She identified the window on the 4th day with certainty. Roy was on the North End assignment. His first hour habit would place him at the South End from the start of the rotation. The outer gate relief guard was a newer man, who had not yet lost his nervousness, which meant he completed his outer gate report faster than the experienced men, which gave her a slightly longer window on the corridor end. 18 minutes. 14 people in 18 minutes. She worked through it step by step until every step lived in her body rather than her mind, until she was not thinking it but doing it from somewhere more reliable than thought. On the fourth evening, Clara sat across from her at the meal table and ate without talking for most of the meal. Near the end, she said quietly, without looking up, "Are you all right?" Mira understood what the question was asking and answered the part that was being asked. "I will be," she said. Clara looked at her plate for a moment. "I plan to sleep very heavily tonight," she said. "Very deeply. I expect most people on this corridor will." Mira said nothing. There was nothing to say. This was the third gift, the largest one, and like the others, it could not be acknowledged. She let it sit between them and took it in completely, and that was all. She went to bed at the normal hour and lay in the dark with her eyes open and went through every step of the night forward, then backward, then forward again, until it was not a plan anymore, but simply knowledge that lived in her the way the needle lived in her hand. At the third hour of the night she rose, dressed without a light, and walked to the laundry room. Passage door, connecting passage, weight of the second door, gate bar in the bracket. She lifted it with both hands, an inch from the bracket first, to clear the base before tilting. No sound, the gate swung inward. The first man through was Frank Doyle from the third cell. His hand found her wrist in the dark, and she directed him into the passage with a single forward pressure, and he went. Then the second, then the third. She counted them in the dark by touch and sound, each one arriving at the gate mouth and being directed forward, each 30 seconds apart, her timing held in her chest like the rhythm of breathing. 4, 5, 6, 7. At 7, she heard something. A sound from the south end. Not Roy's predictable occasional movement, a door. Footsteps at a different cadence, coming north. She put one hand out flat into the corridor. The 8th prisoner, just emerging from the south cell area into the north zone, felt the flat palm against his chest, and went completely still. She counted the footsteps. She measured the distance. 12 yards from the south end corridor junction. 12 yards, walking. 6 seconds. Then a pause. The sound of something set down and picked up again. Then footsteps going back south. She counted 5 full seconds after the footsteps faded. Then she pressed forward. The 8th man through. 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. The last was her father. She knew it before he reached her. She knew it from the chain contact that had confirmed his order. He was last, because the 8th cell was furthest south, and she had planned the extraction in order, nearest the gate first, furthest last, to minimize the distance each person needed to travel in the corridor before entering the passage. She knew it also because she knew his hand. She had known it since before she could read. He reached the passage entrance in the dark, and his hand found her arm, and he stopped. He stopped completely, the way a person stops when something in their body recognizes something before their mind does. She felt him understand, in the dark of a passage that smelled of old stone and cold water, who was holding his arm, and what it meant that she was here. She held his hand for 3 seconds. He held back. Then she pressed forward, directing him toward the exit, and after a moment that was very small and also very large, he went. She felt him move forward, felt the cold air enter as the exit was pushed open, felt him pass through it and disappear into the dark. She sealed the passage entrance from the inside. She stood in the dark for a moment. 14 people had just gone through that passage. Every cell in the block was empty. She went back through the passage, replaced the gate bar, sealed the connecting door, and stood in the laundry room. She sat down at the pressing table. She put her hands flat on the surface. She breathed. Then she picked up the sheet from the top of the basket and began to fold it, and her hands were steady, and the night was quiet, and tomorrow the soldiers were coming. The county authority troops arrived on a Thursday morning, 14 men in the uniform of the magistrate's office, led by a captain named Gilbert who rode with the particular manner of a man who has been delivering official documents his whole life, and has learned that the manner matters as much as the document. The gates opened for them. Lord Edmund Holt was many things, but he was not someone who refused entry to the county authority, with 14 men, and a sealed order from the magistrate's office. The gates opened and the riders came through, and Mira, in the laundry room with the morning linen, heard the difference in the sound of the estate that followed, the particular quality of silence that falls over a building when something official and irreversible has begun. She stayed at her table. She kept working. Within the hour she heard Lord Holt move from the main house to the east wing, quickly and with men behind him. She heard the sound of a man moving through a building with purpose, and then stopping. The sound of a door, a pause, then nothing, for a long time. The dungeon was empty. Every cell. Not a single prisoner remaining. 2 hours after the captain's arrival, Geoffrey Plum appeared in the laundry room doorway, with the tightness around his jaw that meant the morning had not gone according to anything planned. "All staff to the main hall," he said, "by order of Captain Gilbert." Clara set down her work. Mira set down her iron. The main hall held 32 staff, from the head cook to the youngest stable boy, standing in the loose arrangement of people who do not know what is happening, and are keeping a careful distance from each other as a result. Captain Gilbert stood at the front with a table and 2 of his men, one holding a clipboard. He did not spend time on preamble. "This estate has been operating outside the established law concerning private debt recourse," he said. "Specifically, the holding of individuals in private cells on these grounds without formal county authority, trial, or limitation of time. By the order of the Lord Magistrate, this practice is terminated. Any individuals currently detained are to be released immediately." He looked at the group. "We have found no individuals currently in detention. We are therefore conducting a full accounting of persons present in this estate over the past 6 months." A man at the table began calling names from the clipboard. When he reached her name, "Mira Grant, laundress, 4 months of service," she said, "Here," and he made his mark and moved on. After the accounting was finished, and the group was beginning to disperse, Captain Gilbert said, "I need to speak individually, with any staff member who was present in the East Wing, at any point between the hours of the 2nd and 5th hour of the night, at any time in the past 6 months." The hall went quiet. Mira Cole stepped forward. The whole room shifted. Ned Hale, standing at the side of the room, looked at her with a sudden, sharpening attention. Lord Holt, who was standing near the back, looked at her with the particular expression of a man who is assembling something that he has not understood until this exact moment. She did not look at any of them. She looked at Captain Gilbert. "I was in the East Wing on multiple occasions, at night, during those hours," she said. "My name is not Mira Grant. My name is Mira Cole. My father, Owen Cole, was held in this dungeon from November of last year until 3 weeks ago." The hall was very quiet. She stood in the center of it. She had been invisible in this building for 4 months. She was done being invisible. "Come with me," Gilbert said. She followed him to a side room off the main hall. One of his men sat at the back. Another stood at the door. She sat down across from him at the small table, and she told him, all of it, plainly and in order. She left out Agnes by name, that protection she had decided on before she ever stepped into the hall. She described the passage as something she had found and used, with assistance she was not able to name. Everything else she told him completely, from the morning in November when they came for her father, to the night 2 weeks ago when 14 people went through a 40-yard passage in the dark and came out the other side. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he looked at his hands for a moment. 23 people, he said, using the number she had given him. From both operations, including the first group of 5, she said. He looked at her for a long time. She looked back at him steadily. "You are aware," he said, "that Lord Holt will dispute every part of this." "I expect he will," she said. "And you understand that I will need a formal written statement." "Yes," she said. "I am ready to give one." He nodded, slowly, as a man nods when he is taking the measure of something larger than he expected to find. "You entered this estate under a false name," he said. "Yes," she said. "For the purpose of gaining access to the cell block." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Tell me about the people who were in those cells." She told him. Every name she had, every cell position, every date of intake, where she knew it. She told him about Will Marsh, and his wife, and 2 daughters. About Peter Dove, and the land meeting. About Arthur Lane, 17 years old. About the men she had brought out in groups of 3, and the ones she had not yet reached when the message came that she had 10 days. She told him about her father walking down the lane in unlaced boots without turning around. She was kept at the estate for 2 more days, while the formal statements were drafted and witnessed. She slept in the servants' quarters. She ate the meals. She was polite to Geoffrey Plum when she encountered him, and she said nothing to Ned Hale, and she did not see Lord Holt at all. On the 3rd morning, Captain Gilbert handed her a document, a formal letter bearing the county magistrate's seal, naming her as a material witness in the proceedings against Lord Edmund Holt, free to go pending her availability to testify. "You are free to go, Miss Cole," he said. She walked out through the side entrance. She crossed the stone path to the outer gates. A man opened them for her, and she walked through. The lane outside the estate was empty. The iron gate swung shut behind her, with the weight of something final and definite. She stood in the lane and looked at the open road ahead, and the open fields to either side, and the open sky above, and she stood there for a moment, with all of it around her. She breathed. Then she walked. She did not take the direct road to Grenfell. She came around through the north, along the edge of the forest, passing by the trees she knew, the path she had walked on a cold morning 4 months ago, with her documents in her coat, and the frost on the ground. She stopped at the hollow. She did not go in. She stood outside the curtain and said, quietly, "It is done." There was a silence on the other side. Then the curtain moved, and Agnes's hand came through it, holding a small folded cloth. Mira took it. Inside was her front door key. She walked the rest of the way to Grenfell. The village was going about its ordinary business, in the flat light of a winter afternoon. She passed the mill and the inn and the church with the cracked bell and the corner house where Dorothy Wren lived, and she walked down the lane to her gate, and through it, and up the path to her door, and she unlocked it and went inside. The house was exactly as she had left it, her mother's chair by the window, the shelf above the second window with its familiar shapes, the coat peg by the door. The coat was still there. She stood in front of it for a long time. In the weeks that followed, 3 families in Grenfell came to her separately to say things that were partial versions of what they had heard. She confirmed nothing specific and denied nothing. She told each family that the matter was being attended to through the county authority, which was true, and that things would be different, which she believed. Owen Cole came home to Grenfell in March, on a Wednesday afternoon, while she was sitting at the kitchen table with a needle and thread in the light from the window. She heard the footsteps on the path, and then the door opened. He stood in the doorway. He was thinner. His face had new lines that had not been there before. He held himself with a new carefulness, the careful quality of someone who has been in a place that required them to hold themselves carefully for a very long time, and has not quite let go of that habit yet. He looked at her. She stood up. He crossed the room, and she stepped forward, and he held her, in the way that parents hold the people they love, when they have come very close to something too large to name, and then come back from it, tightly, and then tighter, and for a long time neither of them said anything. "How?" he said eventually. Just that one word. "I found a door," she said. He pulled back to look at her face. She let him look. He was searching for the mark of what it had cost her, the particular quality that 4 months inside a place like that left on a person. She did not try to make it easier for him to see. "I am all right," she said, truly. He looked at her for another moment, then he nodded, because he believed her, and also because he understood that all right could include things that had required a great deal of giving. He stayed. He fixed the 3rd stair 2 weeks after he arrived, working one morning while she was out. She came home and walked to the 3rd step, and pressed down and heard nothing, just solid wood, and she stood there for a moment in the hallway with her hand on the wall. In the summer, Owen Cole began telling the story at the inn. He told the parts he knew, which were the parts from inside the cells, the waiting, the lean meals, the small paper signals in the bread rolls, the night of the final escape. He told it the way a person tells a thing they have thought about every single day since it happened. People listened. The story moved through the valley in the way that all stories move, changing slightly with each person who carried it, gaining details in some places and losing precision in others, until what circulated bore only a partial resemblance to the original. In every version of the story, the woman in the passage was described differently. Some versions had her older, some younger. Some gave her a lantern she had not carried. Some gave her words of comfort she had not spoken. In one version, that eventually reached Mira through Dorothy Wren, The woman in the passage had held each person's hand in turn and spoken their name to them before releasing them. This was not what had happened, but Mira found she did not mind that version. It was the version that captured the feeling of the thing, even if it missed the fact. She did not tell anyone the full story herself. Not because she was protecting it, but because the full story had a center that was very difficult to put into words. The decision made on the kitchen floor in the early morning. The particular feeling of choosing to bind yourself to a floor. The specific quality of the dark in the passage, and the weight of the hands that passed through it one by one. These things were real, and they had happened, and they lived in her body, in the specific way that experiences live in the body, when the mind has processed them fully, and returned them to the place where they began. The proceedings against Lord Edmund Holt moved through the county courts across the spring and summer, with the particular deliberateness of official proceedings everywhere. They moved. The tithes on Grenfell land were suspended pending the review. A county officer was assigned to manage the estate, while the proceedings continued, a man named Harold Price, who was practical and uninterested in private holding cells and ran the estate accordingly. In September, the cells under the East Wing were formally closed by county order. A man from the magistrate's office came to inspect the ceiling. Nobody from the inspection team examined the floor of the laundry room with enough attention to find the connecting passage door. Or if someone did, they did not mention it in the report. Mira walked to the hollow one afternoon in the late summer. She sat in the chair across from Agnes and drank tea by the fire, in the same way she had sat there the first time, with the same quality of quiet between them. 23 people, she said at one point. Yes, said Agnes. They sat for a while with that number in the room. What do you do now? Agnes asked. Mira thought about it. The same things, she said. But different. Agnes waited. Before, Mira said, I did the ordinary things because they were what was there to do. Now I do them because I have chosen them. That is a different feeling. Not a better feeling necessarily, just a different one. Like knowing the weight of something because you have carried it. Agnes looked at her with the clear eyes that had been watching this valley for longer than Mira had been alive, and she nodded in the way of someone for whom this particular truth was not news but was always worth hearing. You carried it well, Agnes said. That was all. Mira walked home through the late summer forest, where the light came through the canopy in the slow, golden way of August afternoons, when the year has not yet turned, but you can feel the turn approaching. She walked without hurrying. The lane was open. The road beyond it was open. The whole wide, ordinary world was open in all directions, and it was hers. She did not feel about it the way she had felt before. Freedom, she had discovered, felt different when you knew the weight of its opposite. It was heavier and lighter at the same time, more real in both directions, the way things are when you have traded something genuine to have them, and know exactly what the trade cost. She came out of the trees onto the lane. The village was ahead of her, smoke from the chimneys, the sound of the mill, the ordinary life of an ordinary place, going on, in the way that ordinary places go on. She walked through it, and down the lane, and in through her gate, and up the path. She sat at the table by the window. She picked up her needle and thread. The work was there, where she had left it, patient and ready, waiting for her, the way work waits when it is yours, and will always be yours. She stitched. Outside, the lane was empty, and the road was open, and the sky was very large above the valley. The ordinary world was going on around her in its ordinary way, full of the ordinary things that hold a life together, the bread, and the fire, and the conversation, and the particular weight of a good day's work done well. She was in it. She was fully in it. Her shadow was here, in this room, at this table, in this life she had chosen. Not stitched to any floor she had not chosen herself. The needle moved through the cloth with the steady, precise care of a person who knows exactly what her hands are for, and is glad to be using them. She was exactly where she had decided to be. And that, in the end, was the thing that no one else could give her, and no one else could take away.